So talking about Welsh witchcraft, leading very seamlessly into my next question, does it differ from other witchcraft practices? Does Welsh witchcraft have its own specific practices?
So yes, in kind of in general, the primary place I think that Welsh witchcraft tends to reside is that it focuses predominantly on the culture of Wales. So that's the very easy way to say it. It's that it's rooted in our culture and our language and such. But embedded into our culture and our language is a series of kind of beliefs and stories and such that kind of color and amplify the way in which people interact with that magic and that witchcraft. So one thing that is inherently important within our tradition, which a lot of other cultures can relate to, but it's something that I love about our culture specifically, is our love and appreciation of song, of poetry, and of the Bardic arts in general. So the Bardic tradition in Wales is such an important and integral aspect of who we are as a people. It's in our national anthem. We sing it, we sing Gwlad Beirdd a Chantorion, which literally translates to a land of singers and bards. That's what we describe ourselves as. And it's this tradition of bardic kind of artistry that really carried the Welsh culture for a long, long time. So when you look into traditions associated with magic in Wales, a lot of it harkens back to that bardic tradition where words and song and poetry and story were inherently important. So the bard, somebody who practiced that poetry and such, they were inherently mystical people. And one way to like really, really amplify that and make it clear to people is that the wizard Merlin, who everybody knows, because he has this like identity now within the world as being this pop culture icon. You say the word Merlin, everyone knows who you're talking about, that wizard from Arthuriana. His origins, however, his oldest origins, harken back to old Brythonic and Welsh literature and mythology. So the oldest texts we have relating to Merlin come from a region that we refer to as Yr Hen Ogledd, which is located in like the northernmost parts of England and the southernmost parts of Scotland, but they're all written in Old Welsh, or Middle Welsh specifically, in Middle Welsh. And so he's originally called Myrddin. And in the original Welsh texts, he's never referred to as a wizard, but he is referred to as a bard. And that's because those two words within a Welsh cultural context essentially mean the same thing. The bard is somebody who, via their mastery of words, via their skill and proficiency in poetry and words, can change the world around them. And they draw the power to come up with these words, to create these poems, from a source known as Arwen, which starts its life in the Otherworld, an Anofn. So with all of this in mind, it's this very mystical system of creating art and poetry. So that kind of echoes within almost every magical tradition that we have throughout the Welsh cultural continuum. So when we look at the tradition of charming, so charms were a big part of Welsh folk magic, we see the idea of poetry and lyricism coming up, where these charms, which were recited spells or written spells and charms, they had this pattern of having to have this rhyme and this story and this narrative within them, and they follow in similar patterns to the poetry of the bards from the much earlier periods. So there's that continuation of this magic being propelled and helped by poetry and the power of words in itself. So a lot of Welsh witchcraft, I would say, is rooted in the power of the spoken word, of song, and of breath. So those are the primary elements that make it quite unique as well.
I always think that spells benefit from rhymes because it's lyrical, isn't it? And there is something magical about lyrics and rhythm. So that makes perfect sense. And of course, the Arwen, very much associated with Druidry as well, isn't it? With the inspiration, the creativity. Now, I mentioned the Mabinogi, and I hope I'm saying it correctly. How does that fit into the whole scheme of your witchcraft, your spiritual practice, what you do?
So the Mabinogi are essentially our oldest stories. So we treat them as a mythology to turn to, as a kind of source of inspiration and information. It gives us a little insight into the way our culture and our people have worked and understood the world around them for the longest of time. The stories themselves are recorded in medieval manuscripts. So because of that, there's a lot of debate over like how old they actually are and such. There's no doubt that they are much older than the written versions we have, the oldest written versions, that those are copies of copies of copies, that it's possible that these versions we have now are much later editions that come from around the 14th century, but that they come originally from a Bardic tradition of storytelling, which was oral in its nature. And what that means is that people didn't write these stories down. They didn't like to write them down for the longest time. And so when we look back at the history of the Mabinogi, we have to take that into consideration and think, how much have they changed after they got written down? Like, once something is written down, it becomes almost solid and canonized, and people then argue, like, what's the correct version? Whereas with an oral tradition of storytelling, you can imagine that the storytellers who would have told these tales, who would have performed these tales for audiences, they probably would have changed bits and they probably would have altered things almost every single time they do it. Which there's a magic to that in and of itself. So when we look at the stories today, we have to keep in mind that they have that medieval kind of layering over them, but that they likely are much older than that. They have quite a Christian layering over them as well, but it is clear when you read the stories that they are set in a period of time before the coming of Christianity to Britain. So there are many debates as to whether they are pre-Christian mythologies. My personal opinion on that is that I think they are certainly echoes of pre-Christian mythology, perhaps with that layering of Christianity and medieval society kind of layered over it, but that they have an echo or an imprint or a blueprint of a mythology that was probably part and package of the landscape that we reside within now. And these stories, when they were presented to us growing up, they were never like these fantastical tales that were far, far away from us, even though they had these like really fantasy and magical elements. There are magical cauldrons and giants and wizards and, magical women who come from the otherworld and such. And all of that makes it really interesting and intriguing. But at the same time, when we were told the stories as kids in school, they were never presented to us as these fairy tale stories that happened once upon a time in a time and a place far, far away. It was always a case of, this is our history, this is our tradition, our landscape, and these stories happened not in some magical fantasy land far, far away from where we can imagine. They happened down the road, they happened just over there, up that hill, that's where this happened. And so they felt really localized and really familiar, and they sing of things that we can relate to on a deep visceral level. So though the stories have those magical elements, they also speak at their core about what it means to be human. So within my practice, I turn to these stories to inspire and inform my magic, but also my spirituality and the way that I move in the world as well, if that makes sense.